Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here, and it's update day. The Rakarth update has dropped, the Rakarth FLC, alongside a slew of changes to multiplayer as well as campaign, mostly campaign of course. And yeah, some of these are cool, some of these are interesting. Rakarth himself is, in my opinion, a fairly fun lord, at least in campaign. He does have some respectable combat stats. He's got a fun selection of units. You start off with some pretty cool units, and it's pretty easy to get access to his big monstrosities. He of course does get access to several non-Dark Elf related units, such as various dinosaurs, mammoths, and such units, and you can get some of those very early. You could even get those in the first 5 turns of the game, units like mammoths. So it's a pretty fun, kind of goofy in some ways campaign, perhaps a little bit easy, but it's a unique enough start position, and in my opinion, unique enough play style to where it makes Rakarth a fun choice on the battlefield, and a fun choice to play as. If you're looking to do something different with Dark Elves, looking not to start in the same old corner of the world where almost all of them start, then he can be good fun over in Albion. However, of course, he is not the only addition, and Wood Elves were added or Wood Elves not added. I'd be a little late to the party there. They were added a couple of years ago now, but Wood Elves, the Forge of Daith, got an update. Yeah, in my opinion, not very significant. Now you're gonna have better choice in what items you get, and how they're upgraded and reforged and yada yada. And as a result, those items have also been debuffed in some ways. Not all of them, I guess. Like, you get extra speed here, and more speed on the Dreaming Boots, but you're losing campaign range. In my opinion, it's not that big of a difference. The Forge of Daith items were not exactly something I was relying on or counting on, really, when I played my games. It just wasn't. It wasn't like a crutch unit or crutch item that I was desperate to have. It wasn't something that was super decisive. Oftentimes I'd swap it out for campaign items found on the campaign because they're sometimes just better. And so while it's cool to see some extra player agency being involved here, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference really for most campaigns. It certainly won't for me, and maybe it will for you guys. Be sure to let me know down below, but I don't think it's a huge amount of difference there, since this is kind of a small flavor mechanic, more so than anything integral to the Sisters of Twilight campaign experience. Crone Hellebron, however, has had a much more significant revamp. Blood Voyages can now actually be sustained and replenished. It all depends on just how well how good your Death Knight effects are. If you're stuck, obviously, well, you don't want to be stuck at a low level of Death Knight no matter what, but extra Chaos Corruption is terrible. Less public order, especially on a faction like Dark Elves who struggle with public order already, not great. So we all know the usual effects here. So you want to keep that Blood Knight power up. Get that extra physical resistance on your Harganeth and Witch Cult related units, always nifty. Perfect Vigor, of course, for those units is really, really strong. Extra Public Order is insane, as is Extra Leadership. Well, Extra Leadership not so much for Dark Elves, since they have pretty good leadership to begin with, but Extra Public Order is very, very strong. And of course, if you're actually able to maintain this level 5 of the Death Knight, you can then prop up your Blood Voyages and keep them replenishing, which is really, really nifty. Now, it should be mentioned, Blood Voyages now don't have Unbreakable. That was one of the things they had before. All the units in a Blood Voyage were Unbreakable. They would fight to the bitter end. But they have Perfect Vigor now, and of course are able to potentially replenish. They also are much more mobile. They've got increased movement range, which is pretty cool in my opinion. Being able to, one of the annoying things in my experience with Blood Voyages, granted it's been a couple patches now since I played Hellebron, but one of the annoying things with Blood Voyages is that they're pretty slow and immobile. It takes a while to get to, say, Ulthuan, which is kind of a lot of times your objective. You start in Harganeth, and just trying to get Blood Voyage down to Ulthuan can take like a year and a half, but now they should be a bit more mobile. And Besides that, some of her skills kind of reworked or revamped here. Extra missile resist to Witch Elves and Hargan Executioners. When you think about this, this is pretty significant. If you've got your Witch Elves who start at 20% public order, get them, or 20% physical resistance, get them an extra 20% physical resistance from level 5 here. And I do believe there's other skills in the Dark Elf tree that give them even more resistance. And then get them an extra 10% missile resist. You've got Witch Elves that against physical missiles can basically shrug off most pressure, which is pretty nifty in my opinion. Definitely very, very useful. A little bit of a pity that Sisters of Slaughter seemingly don't get this. It would be very useful in them, but because they of course also have shields. But you know what? It's not a bad perk there. It's kind of like Volkamar's Flagellance, or being able to, or really, I should say, Empire Flagellance being able to roid up to significant missile resist, which on Archlectors, which is pretty cool. Going on to Lokir Fellheart, he now gets a unique agent, the Blessed Dread, which is his black arc, and it's basically a roided up black arc. And it gets a unique landmark building. It's, I guess, useful if you're fighting on the coast. Black Arcs, of course, have always been kind of an awkward unit. They offset the fact that Dark Elves lack a global recruitment. And they've gotten much improved over the last 2 patches. They're a much more potent force, potent support force, much more capable of like really supporting an army. But ultimately, you're still locked to the coast. And in the case of Lustria, which is where you're usually fighting with Lokir, unless you decide to pack your bags and leave, it's often a bit difficult. You run out of coast pretty quickly. Obviously, you can sweep through the peripheries and knock out Luther Harkon and knock out Teclis and those characters fairly quickly. But especially on the Mortal Empires map, there's quite a lot of inland area where you just don't get the support from Black Arc. So, well, it's cool here that he does get some unique perks as Black Arc, synergizing more with the pirate theme, I suppose, that Lokir has. It's ultimately, I don't think, going to be particularly useful. Then there's also been some right updates. The Right of Anathrema now grants additional raising sacking income, extra Black Arc growth, and 20% movement range, with many of the previous skills now in Lokir's personal skill trait. His innate trait with Kraken Lord gives fear to Corsair units. Not sure how super useful that is. It's one of those things that Wulfric also gets. Well, Wulfric gets it for all his units, whereas Kraken Lord just affects Corsairs. But not sure how useful that's going to be, because ultimately, I guess it helps them deny fear. If they're fighting units that cause fear, that's nice. It gives them a little bit of extra leadership. But Dark Elves don't have huge leadership issues, especially versus AI that doesn't flank or try to leadership bomb you. It's not really a problem. Your units will often fight to the death anyway, so I don't really see a huge advantage here. But, you know, it's something. And immunity to sea attrition, it's useful in niche circumstances, but you're not traveling on the high seas all that often, even though you are supposed to be a pirate character. Corsair Noble, new effect, 100% AP damage for Corsairs, AP missile damage. Not really that useful when you think about it. The base AP damage on Corsairs is Corsair handbows is very, very low. So we're talking an improvement of like 2 points of AP or something. It against high armor targets, this does actually make a significant difference. Perhaps it does mean you'll be pouring out a lot more DPS, but against anything with lighter armor, you're not going to feel this effect really. It's just a slight damage boost. You do get your favored corruption and your more public order in a local province, which is definitely not terrible, especially in Lustria, where you're often dealing with Skaven corruption, which can be major league issues. And of course, you're often dealing with Luther Harkon's vampiric corruption. Being able to undo that quicker is useful for sure. Vanguard deployment for Corsairs and stock for Corsairs is pretty cool here with Head of the Tide. Problem is that you don't, in my opinion, really want a Corsair army going to late game. Corsairs are just not that good. They're not their campaign's an event. Campaign is dominated by missile play. Corsair missile play is just not that strong, and their melee prowess is very mediocre. So all these perks on Corsairs, it's like, why would I want to bother with any of these? Extra use on Blackhawk bombardments is not bad for sure. Better Lord Recruit rank, definitely nice with the Patriarch with the Fellhearts here, and reduced right cost for Anathema and Sacrifice to Mothlan, definitely not bad. Get those Blackhawks if you want more of them, and being able to get those perks from Anathema, definitely useful, because those are some pretty hefty buffs, especially the extra, well, really, the Blackhawk growth is kind of whatever in my mind, but the buffs sacking, raising, and movement range are huge. And then, once again, +8 melee attack when fighting at sea, another one of those sort of niche perks. It's okay. I'm not going to complain. Marathi now gets Dark Manipulator, which provides -50% cost and cooldown reductions to Sacrifice to Karti, so that's kind of cool to see. Supreme Sorceresses now get a unique skill, which reduces cooldown and vigor loss, and most importantly gives them the bound spell Urnzripal's Black Horror, Black Horror, which is objectively the coolest spell in the entire game. Just a roiling cloud of smoke, annihilating all before it. I basically always bring this spell on Supreme Sorceresses in a campaign, or in a multiplayer, just because if you're going to run them, you got to bring this spell. It looks awesome. There are no acceptable deviations from that. But no, in all seriousness, it's pretty cool to see. Getting a Bound Wind spell, especially a pretty powerful one like Urnzripal's Black Horror, is going to be nifty in campaign. Help you clean out those AI lines forming on your ranks a bit faster. High Beastmasters, and have gotten the Whiplash as a just an ability. Whiplash is pretty strong. Obviously gives them the ability to buff up some monsters quite a lot. That said, not sure how useful it's going to be. Usually you don't have great access to large units early on in a campaign, so I don't know if there's much to Whiplash early on. Usually your armies as Dark Elves tend to be built up around masses of missiles, and yeah, you're not going to Whiplash Shades to work harder. The odds are they will shoot you and skin you alive. So yeah, not sure just how useful this will be. I guess it does save you a skill point, but unless you're doing doom stacks with Dark Elves, which once again not that useful for a faction for a faction that doesn't have healing. You're not doom stacking all that often, so I'm not sure how useful Whiplash is really going to be. But getting this early in a campaign, but you know, it's cool to have, I suppose. It's a buff. Corsairs and Charybdis now have immunity to sea attrition and reef attrition. That's kind of cool, but once again, super niche. Some minute changes here, some technology changes to buff up your trash troops, and some buffs to fighting on the seas, and reduced requirement to the rating cost for Dark Elf factions, definitely useful, definitely thematic for what is a pirate-oriented faction, and then some bug fixes. But all in all, fairly minute updates. It was mostly the lore stuff, especially for Loke here, that was discussion worthy. Skaven here have had some changes to mostly corruption and menace below. Before, Skaven corruption was something you couldn't really undo all that much. You could build your scrap pile. I'm sorry, a slight slip up there, but it could reduce you could produce scrap piles, but you really didn't have many ways to produce Untainted as Skaven. But now there are several chains here of that reduce the amount of that produce Untainted now, and your plague chain no longer produces as much corruption. So if you're fighting against Skaven, you don't have to deal with their crap as much. And if you are playing as Skaven, you don't have to worry about over-corrupting your own province if you're trying to avoid that and ruining your public order and that sort of thing. So all in all, several reductions here, and improvements to public order from their efficient planning provincial commandment. So that's definitely useful. Should make it much more easier to manage Skaven. It does, however, mean it's going to be harder to get Menace Below charges. And they no longer get the Skaven no longer get a free charge of Menace Below. So that was before you'd randomly get a beforehand you'd always get a extra charge of Menace Below, which is just kind of weird. There were often situations where you just get more Menace Below opportunities than you should have. There's when you here it says now here they're mentioning that there should be a slight reduction to the number of Menace Below charges passively gained. However, I think when you synergize it with the fact that overall Skaven corruption here is going to be reduced, and so you're usually not going to be fighting in provinces as saturated with Skaven corruption. I think overall you're going to see a more significant reduction in how many Menace Below charges you get in a practical game. Now, obviously, if you're playing on a higher difficulty, Menace Below can be kind of lackluster because many artillery crews will resist your Menace Below summon until it routes off. They won't even be able to kill off an artillery crew. They won't even be able to kill, much less a missile unit, because basic clan rats with how melee is gimped in higher difficulties are just not very good. But so the fact that you get even less of it, not ideal, I think. But at least you should be able to generate more via food. So not exactly the end of the world. It's not like you crush too hard on Menaces Below as Skaven to begin with, but definitely a nerf, and definitely something that's going to make, well, the Menace Below thing will make life a little more difficult. Though, on the other hand, being able to have better public order with Untainted, it could be better. Especially because AI doesn't care too much about corruption anyway. So when you're playing as a Skaven, this might work out as a bit more of a buff, but when you're playing against Skaven, it's also a fix. So all in all, a solid combo there. You no longer get the Pestilence Scheme or the Scheme of Doom as minor Skaven factions, so something you don't have to deal with as the player. I don't necessarily think that should have been done. As a player, you could always assassinate them with a character. So if this was really a concern for you, dealing with these annoying engineers. But I guess it does make it a little easier to control, especially if you're not on top of that as much. Clan Pestilence is no longer afflicted by plagues, so that's nice, I suppose. And now the Skaven Warp Bomb is no longer as available. This was a major pain in the rear before, especially when you fought Skaven garrisons from AI, because they'd have garrisons all over the place. And now you got to deal with multiple Warp Bombs, synergizing with Menace Below charges, and potentially deleting entire units. You'd have to deal with them with single entities, essentially, because you got no other choice. You also get a wall settlement map now with Empire Forts and High Elf Gates. And then there's been a few other bug changes overall, like more base growth on Tomb King buildings, for example, but by and large, nothing too crazy there. For multiplayer, which is really what I like to focus on, I will note, before I get into this, there have been a lot of, or maybe not a lot, but several patch notes in here that have been missed. And I will try to recall most of them as I go through here. I've got some written out and touch upon them as we go through, but I'm sure there are many more that I've missed as well. There might be some other stuff buried in stat changes for abilities or spells that I simply I'm not really able to check. And if you happen to know any further balance patch changes that I missed while I'm going through these, certainly mention them down below. Shame on CA for not being able to put out the proper patch notes here, not actually putting out all the fixes, but unfortunately it is what it is. So, missile, first and foremost, missile chariots now reflect missile strength correctly. So, for example, war wagons, which used to say they do almost no missile damage, now show that they do a lot of missile damage. This is simply because now it's actually calculating for all 6 gunners per wagon instead of just calculating for 1 gunner. But that doesn't necessarily mean they actually perform any better. It just means that you can actually tell their performance more easily when you look at them. For the Dark Elves, the High Beastmaster has been nerfed basically across the board. Of course, Whiplash was buffed. And then the charge bonus from the Scourge Runner was nerfed. I don't think the Scourge Runner was a very popular mount for him to begin with, so I'm not entirely sure why. He did get a little bit more AP damage, a little bit more AP missile damage, but ultimately he's a single Scourge Runner Chariot, so he's never been a particularly good choice here. I would have expected a more significant missile change, at least, but it didn't happen, so too bad, I guess. And his Manticore got nerfed as well, losing some bonus versus large. Admittedly, I don't know if there's much of a reason for this. In multiplayer, Beastmasters are not exactly a top-tier pick. They're not a terrible choice, don't get me wrong. I'm sure there's somebody about to shout that, oh, I use a Beastmaster pretty often. But they're not a top-tier choice. You do not see Beastmasters all that often. Morathi, of course, and Malekith are still much more dominant choices, as are Supreme Sorceresses, and maybe even Dreadlords with crossbows. Beastmasters aren't a bad character. They're not quite as bad as, say, Melee Dreadlord. They've got their niche. They've got a Tormentor Sword, which is really nice. They've got a very strong Whiplash effect, which to buff big targets, but ultimately, very niche unit, so nerfing them seems pretty uncalled for, especially when we're not seeing nerfs to Morathi, we're not seeing nerfs to Malekith, we're not seeing nerfs to what are more overbearing characters. So I don't really see the point here. Going on to Wood Elves, Ariel had some major changes here. Leadership dropped from 100 to 90, and she lost Unbreakable. So no longer will you have situations where you trigger army losses on Wood Elves and then have a death ball of Orion and Ariel being a pain in the rear. Her entity mass was increased, which should hopefully make it harder to knock her down and in turn easier to kill off with large units, which before she'd kind of bowl those over, either bowl over small stuff and run away, or and deny getting hit, or she'd get knocked over by large stuff and evade hits that way. Leadership at 90 is still insane. She's still going to be very, very difficult to route. But at least, and especially because she also has Fear and Terror baked in, but at least it means that she's no longer an unbreakable murder monster in late games. The Glade Lords, both female and male, have gotten a Great Stag buff. The Great Stag now does AP damage, and actually does more overall damage than it did before. As you can see, their weapon strength went from 260 to 130 on AP. So you used to have 360 weapon strength, now you're going to have 380, and it's majority AP, so that's a pretty strong buff to their melee performance. It definitely makes the Great Stag a more appealing choice. Lost Sylvan Knights, the Ethereal Great Stag Knight Regiment of Renown, were nerfed, losing some HP, and I think that was a warranted change. The Ethereal Stags could definitely be a bit oppressive. However, one of the things that is not mentioned here is that the Great Stag Knights also had a nerf to shield power. Before, they sat at 55% silver shields. Now they sit at 30% bronze shields, which is, in my opinion, pretty bad for such a flimsy unit. It makes them very vulnerable to missile pressure. Before, for example, Huntsmen were still a massive threat, but at least you could shrug off half the fire with your shields. Now you can only shrug off a third of that fire. You're going to take much, much, much more damage. And it is, in my opinion, a completely uncalled for change. As far as these patch notes say, the charged bug that affects Great Stag Knights, where their charge doesn't correctly connect with other large countercharging cavalry, has not been fixed. So there is really no reason, I think, to be nerfing Stag Knights like this. It is an unwarranted nerf, in my opinion. And so losing the shield values there is terrible. The HP change to the Ethereals, I think, is okay, though. So no comment here, but the loss of shielding that's not mentioned here is a pain in the rear. Giant Wolves had their melee building damage reduced. That's probably, in campaign, they could really buzzsaw through a gate in, like, no time at all. So I suppose that is why that CA didn't want them buzzsawing through a gate with just a bunch of angry dogs. But yeah, that is something worth keeping in mind there. All in all, for Wood Elves, the changes I think were fair up at the top here, but there are further changes, of course, to abilities, which we'll be discussing once we get to the ability section. But the change to the Great Stag Knight Shield is, in my opinion, completely ridiculous. Norscan Ice Wolves also do less gate damage. I don't think I've ever used Ice Wolves in campaign, so I've never noticed this, but I guess they've always done very good building damage. This Super Squig now actually has a decent chunk of HP, still not great, but enough to tank a stray arrow here and there. Maybe make it a little more viable. Before, this unit was a total joke because it took an insane amount of micro just to even get it to explode, because it would normally die to stray arrows. Thrall took a significant nerf, as did the Packmaster, losing a lot of melee defense on their Broodhorrors and quite a bit of mass. Should make it harder for them to extricate themselves. The Broodhorror itself did lose some melee defense as well as missile resist. I think it's fair that the Broodhorror got nerfed. It was needed. The unit was a bit overtuned. I do not agree with these nerfs, though. I think the nerf should have been oriented at the Broodhorror's speed. Broodhorror speed sitting at 95, especially with Scurry Away on the characters, makes it an insane unit to hunt down. You're talking 95 speed baseline that spikes up to, I believe, 107 or so speed. That's not even counting abilities triggered. Like a Warlord can trigger the Verminous Valor to get another 25% movement speed. He basically spikes to 130 speed character when he's got Scurry Away active. He's literally uncatchable. And like even a Phoenix cannot catch him at that point. And instead see him nerfs melee defense and mass. I think it's kind of stupid. I think this should have been, they should have lost somewhere between 10 and 15 movement speed and lost Scurry Away when used as a character mount. So big sort of a miss nerf here. They needed a nerf, but not this sort of nerf in my opinion. 95 speed Broodhorrors are still going to be a pain in the rear, though at least it does make them a bit more manageable, I suppose. Wolf Rats took a nerf to melee defense. I think this is another completely unwarranted nerf. Much like the shields on Stags, this unit's melee defense was already trash. The unit was already probably underpriced. Within the context of the Skaven roster, that is okay because the Skaven just have so many other tools that just having the utility of a 95 speed pseudo light cav is huge. But they didn't need a nerf. They're at 550 gold. They were very expensive with their 34 leadership. 2 melee defense isn't a huge nerf. It's not a particularly important nerf, but it's an unnecessary nerf. And much like Sisters of Slaughter, a patch or two ago or maybe more patches at this point, got lost, I believe, 1 or 2 melee defense, and it was completely uncalled for, even though maybe not the most game-breaking thing ever. It feels similar here with the Wolf Rats. It's definitely not going to be as crippling as the shield change to Stags, but just a goofy decision, in my opinion, to nerf them. It's also worth mentioning that Skaven Slaves got an across-the-board increase of 25 gold. So Skaven Slave Slingers, Skaven Slaves, and Skaven Slave Spears all cost 25 gold more. So now Skaven Slaves cost 150, Skaven Slave Spears 175, and Slingers 225. I think that is a very fair nerf. They are for a long time been an overtuned chaff unit, one that holds far better than they should, and they needed the nerf. However, because ultimately you'd see all these Skaven builds where you just see 10 Skaven Slaves or 8 Skaven Slaves or whatever, depending on if you were playing in a tournament scenario or not, making up a quote-unquote frontline for dirt cheap cost, and then that's frontline supplemented by summons and the entire rest of the army being able to focus on damage output. Usually you'd have like a single mortar that deletes all enemy infantry, and all that's left after that is just the horde of anti-large, essentially. So there's some pretty janky balancing there. Skaven Slaves definitely needed the nerf, but what I will say is that none of the other chaff got a nerf. Bretonnian Peasants, Zombies, they did not get a cost nerf, so the fact that Skaven Slaves were uniquely singled out is a bit goofy. For Lizards, Ancient Salamander got a nerf to Mass. Not needed as a nerf. Ancient Salamander's not exactly an overperformer to begin with. So I don't necessarily approve, but at the same time, it shouldn't be a massive game changer here. So there we go. Those are the changes made to units, and as mentioned, there were a few that were just missed here. If there's more that I've missed and that are not included in these patch notes, certainly mention it. What I will say is, while I don't think most of these changes were unwarranted, except the Wolf Rat nerf and the shield nerf to Stags, I think some of these nerfs are definitely missing the mark. Broodhorror nerfs, for example, just seem like they're nerfing stuff that it wasn't in dire need of the nerf. Same here with the High Beastmaster. It's not going to be maybe game breaking, but it also feels very unnecessary and just arbitrary. The High Beastmaster's never been a top tier Lord pick for Dark Elves, so why just nerf him all of a sudden? It feels very goofy, especially on units like Scourge Runner. So that's just some awkward changes there, and a lot of missed opportunity. It's worth keeping in mind that these balance changes are literally just tweaking a number in the code. It's not anything fancy. It's not something super involved. These aren't new animations. These aren't model changes. This isn't something that requires a massive amount of testing in many cases, and still so many overtuned units just slip through here. Fey Enchantress and Paladins, Peasants, the entire poison system, which has been insane. Poison units of all stripes are insanely overtuned at this point, specifically missile poison units, and none of them have gotten any touches. Questing Knights, of course, got no changes. The fact that Bretonnia slid through this patch with literally no changes is very irritating, because they've had several overtuned units that just get ignored because CA doesn't care, I suppose. Greenskins slipping through without any changes on a handful of units. Certainly Greenskins aren't as oppressive, but some of their skirmish cav and their poison ability is very, very irksome. Chameleon Skanks and Laser Lizards slipping through with no changes also seems a bit goofy. Just overall, a lot of missed opportunities on what honestly is a pretty easy task. You just have to tweak a handful of numbers. So the fact that there was no attempt, not even a minute attempt to change some of those units, no zombies, for example, didn't get nerfed, but Skaven Slaves did. Stuff like that. The fact that there was just no effort made there is a bit goofy. Oh, I should also mention Skaven, before I forget, they also did get a nerf to their Poison Wind Mortars. Poison Wind Mortars got an extra 100 gold cost, as well as some slight changes to the ability, which I forgot to mention here. But they are now also more expensive. That should make some of the most oppressive Skaven Slave and Mortar builds a bit more manageable. So definitely a good step there. Though still not really an adequate fix, in my opinion, as we'll discuss in just a bit. For abilities here, Whiplash can now target large entities, which is nice. You can buff up your Lords and Heroes and give them a boost to damage output. Could be potentially very strong on the new character, of course, but since Rakarth gets a dragon, so Whiplash gives you an extra 50% weapon strength. That could be very potent. Could also be pretty strong on buffing Hydras and all those sorts of units. So Whiplash here definitely, I should say it's already strong, but could also be strong buffing up Manticore summon or Manticores mounts that you might be using. You can also now use it to buff up a Master if you've got one escorting you, give him extra bit of damage output. So definitely not bad. Blackhawk abilities now have 60-second cooldown, which is nice, I suppose, in campaign. Greenskins, Squigs now suicide. Well, their suicide was fixed so that it's guaranteed. Before you had a 60 damage because the HP was only 110. Now it's 1,000, so it one-shots the Squig at 660. Some changes to Skaven, to the various Skaven campaign abilities. Warp Bomb now does less damage, so it shouldn't be as destructive if you summon it in a blob and get hit by Clan Rat Summon and Warp Bomb combo. It shouldn't be as brutal. Otherwise, the changes here I don't think are that crippling. Pestilent Birth got nerfed, which is good. Now the Wind's magic cost is higher, so no summon spam will be a bit tougher for the rats. And then Poison Wind is now less reliable. It used to affect basically any multi-entity unit quite heavily that wasn't super, like Monsters Infantry levels, or maybe Monsters Cav in the case of like Demigryphs. But basically any normal Cav or normal-ish Cav would take a lot of damage from Poison Wind, and Infantry just got mulched. Now it's much more Infantry-oriented. Personally, I still hate the Poison Wind contact effect. I hate the way Poison Wind's been implemented, and I really hope it gets changed at some point entirely, but at least it is a nerf, and at least it's something that should make the Poison Wind Mortars and Globes a little bit less potent, though still I think it's going to be very oppressive to deal with, because they're just so good at annihilating infantry. Moving now to the Wood Elves, the Acorn of the Ages now does less AP damage, and the wind-up time is longer. I don't think this was necessary. The AP damage was definitely very strong, so maybe they could have just tweaked one of these. but hitting both is kind of pointless. Conjoined Destiny for the twins now has infinite uses. This might sound incredibly powerful, but usually if you're on an Eagle, which is the mount 90% of the time, one charge is almost heal cap. You're basically going to get no value out of a second charge of Conjoined Destiny. On a dragon, it's a little bit more valuable, but you're not bringing a dragon very often. Big nerf to Drisha here with Rouse to Wrath. The number of uses went from 2 to 1. So now you only get one Dryad summon, which is definitely a downside, and is making Drisha a little bit less powerful. Ancient Protection, the duration went up. That's the passive from, I believe, Lore of High Magic. So that should be a nifty buff there. Winds of Magic cost for the transformation of Kadon for the Eagle has gone down from 18 to 14, the former cost, which I think is fair. The Eagle is definitely worse than the Manticore as a throwaway sort of shotgun unit. However, I'm not entirely sure if this effect was also applied to High Elves. It's not mentioned here, and I did not check it. So that is something I will hopefully be able to check, or you guys will be able to see. I'm not entirely sure if the High Elves got this buff. I think they should have, but I'm not sure if this is just Wood Elf exclusive there. And then the Cloak of Isha. Huge nerf for Orion here. Cloak of Isha, ignore this, it's still a ward save, but Cloak of Isha gave a 44% ward save, which stacks with his 20% physical resist. This has made Orion have 64% physical resist when he is under the threshold of 20% HP. Now he only gets 40% because he's only getting 20% ward save. That is a massive nerf that makes him much more vulnerable to all forms of damage output, and I think is a pretty fair and necessary nerf. So that is it for this patch. I think a lot of missed opportunity. The fact that Bretonnia, the fact that Greenskins, the fact that Lizardmen, certain units just skated through with no effects is, in my opinion, ridiculous. The fact that there were nerfs, well, first of all, the disorganized patch notes are a bit silly, but the fact that there were nerfs made to units that didn't really need them feels kind of dumb. Like Great Stagnites losing shield value, or the Wolf Rats losing melee defense just seems arbitrary and unnecessary. And and some of the nerfs just really missed the mark. If I had to say, I would rate the multiplayer aspect of this balance patch to be pretty bad. I think I'd rate it pretty low. There's definitely a few necessary fixes here that happened, thankfully. The nerfs made to things like the Cloak of Isha, and even there, it might be too much. This might be an over nerf. It might need some rollback on this nerf. Some buffs to the transformation of Kadon Eagle. There were certainly nerfs in here that were necessary for a handful of units. Ariel needed some nerfs. The Sylvan Knights needed some mild nerfs. The Broodhar has been overtuned, but a lot of these nerfs are either missing the mark or just kind of over, perhaps a bit. I don't know if I'd say excessive, but some of the nerfs definitely seem to be missing the mark, and a lot of it seems very unnecessary. I would rate the multiplayer side of this patch to be pretty terrible. I think it's probably one of the weakest efforts, and I get that this is a small sub patch that's just releasing alongside of free LC, but I would rate this one of the weakest efforts CA's made on a balanced patch for multiplayer in a long time. Just so many missed marks here and so many pointless changes. And while, yes, the Skaven nerfs were needed, the buff to the Great Stag Mount and so are good. There's just way too many downsides to make it something I can laud or applaud. And then for the campaign, though, I think it's a pretty solid patch. Some of this stuff isn't too significant, like the Forge of Daith changes, but some of the stuff I think is going to be pretty nifty. Death Knight being more reliable and being able to stick around better is going to be nice. Lokir Fellheart getting a bunch of boosts is definitely very cool. Should make him a bit more fun to play as. Getting our Pulse Black Horror as a balance spell is pretty cool. There's a lot of cool campaign changes here for the Dark Elves, and the Skaven being able to control their corruption better. Very useful. But ultimately, for me, at least the multiplayer side of this patch is a miss. Now, maybe you disagree. Certainly let me know what you guys think down below. If there's any changes that I missed in my sort of glossing over here, certainly let me know. I would not doubt that I missed some. I tried to make note of the ones I saw, but I certainly may have missed some, and it may be worth checking those out. But regardless, hopefully you guys did enjoy the video. Hope you found it informative. As usual, leave your thoughts and opinions down below. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.